the idea of Skywalker, like if we go back far enough to Shmi, Shmi Skywalker has Anakin. There's no father. I don't know a lot of the history about Shmi. I don't know if it's covered in other spots and stuff too. Really. But the topic we kind of talked about was that what if Skywalker isn't really the last name, and the last name is a little bit like we saw like Han Solo was like, my name's Han. He's like, what's your last name? He's like, I don't have a last name, or whatever he says exactly. He's like, okay. He's like, well, who's your parents? He's like, nobody. I'm Solo. Solo. It's like
Solo.
Yeah,
I get you.
Like he just kind of made a name. I was like, what if Skywalker is a little bit more of like when we've seen Game of Thrones and they have like bastard names where it's like here is someone and like they don't really have a family name. Yeah. They are Snow or they are Sand or whatever names.
Common
like
names.
The John Doe, like there is a last name that they're kind of given. And I was like, what if Skywalker is kind of more like that? It's not necessarily a last name. It's something that you're just taking when you don't really have one.
Sure.
And I was like, huh. And as I talked about it with Melanie a little bit more, because it was kind of like we went through and we were talking about, like, well, whenever it's kind of weird that like, well, Leia Organa was taken as a name, and that made sense because it went with Bail. But then why did Luke? You'd figure you want to hide Luke Skywalker because he's Anakin Skywalker's kid. Why do you keep the same name? Why not be Lars? Why not change his name there since he went with them?
Sure.
But what if Skywalker is a bastard name? So like, what if there are other Skywalkers out there, but we don't get to really meet them because we're really following these characters.
Sure.
And then as we talked about it a little bit more, I even went as far as to like, well, if that was the case too, having Rey at the end taking a bastard name that you usually don't want per se and being like, no, it means something. I'm Rey Skywalker. Yeah. Like that kind of could even add a little bit more meaning to that. So it kind of developed as we talked about it into like like a fun little fan theory experiment that we developed. And I wanted to bring it up and like I wanted to kind of bring that up and just talk about like this little idea I had and like how silly it might be, but also how like interesting it could be as like a little story thread because I don't know about the history of Skywalker beyond Shmi. I
mean I think by the time of the sequel trilogy, Skywalker is a whispered name amongst the bad guys and a celebrated name amongst the heroes, right?
Sure.
Like the little kids in the father stable are like, oh, not gonna think I Luke Skywalker, I like to imagine that during the times of the Clone Wars, young children, as these evil robots are descending upon their world, might look up and be like, Skywalker, So I imagine it's a name that eventually gets a lot of respect.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you never consider anybody being like, oh, Skywalker, that's a mighty name for a slave. No one seems to mind or anything. So I am curious on what like the state of Skywalker is. From what I understand, I was trying to look stuff up. It's meant to be just another name out there, It's not like Rockefeller or Kennedy.
Yeah,
it's like Johnson or Antilles. We have a couple Antilles. Like
Antilles becomes a name where it's like, ooh, an Antilles. I know Antilles.
Yeah.
But
there's a Bail Antilles mentioned in episode 1 that might go up for Chancellor. Stuff like that. But it did send me down an interesting rabbit hole because a common thing is like, why does Luke keep that name? Like, Vader's just so scared of Anakin that he never bothers to look like, well, where could a child be? My family, which I mean, all of this is trying to cover up for Lucas's plot holes, which he has many, and we don't care now because we're many years removed, just like we won't care about the sequel ones once we're
many years removed, yeah.
But I did find this really interesting quote from Pablo Hidalgo, and his word is not,
Sure.
He just said it was headcanon, but his headcanon is that Luke goes by Luke Lars. And does so the entire movie up until he comes in and says, I'm Luke Skywalker, I'm here to save you. Because he hears that his father's name was Anakin Skywalker. And as he comes in to save Leia, he doesn't use his uncle's name, who's no longer there. He uses his father's name. And that's when because he's never called Luke Skywalker until before then.
Sure, I guess that's true. You don't hear, like, Luke, they just call him Luke. You never hear him say a last name.
Yeah,
I get what you mean.
And I thought, like, that's a fun idea. I don't think that's the intention, but it's a fun idea. But thinking about it, the only thing that kind of bothers me with it is that Biggs like hears him referred to as Skywalker. He doesn't go like, "What? Who's that?"
Who?
Yeah,
sure.
He just accepts that Luke is called Skywalker, which to me would mean that that's not a big deal for him to say that, right?
Sure, yeah.
And I've realized that we're trying to cover plot holes that didn't exist when the movie was made, so it's who cares anyway? This is just fun nerd stuff.
Yeah.
But I did kind of like that idea that actually he did go by Lars until in the moment of heroics and I'm going to do something with my life. I'm going to save the princess. I'm taking my father's name back. That was kind of a cool idea.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
You know, the only thing that bothers me in that that specific scene was always that Leia went, "You're who?" He goes, "I'm here to rescue you."
Yeah.
Like, it's like, why are you worried about who I am? But I was like, no, she asked you who you were.
Yeah.
I always thought it was like a weird,
Sure.
like, wait, is it weird that she's hung up on who he is? Or is it weird that he doesn't answer it and he goes, "I'm here to rescue you. What are you talking about? Let's go."
Sure.
It was just a funny, like, response back and forth. But no, okay, that's interesting where it's like, no, I've been Luke Lars this whole time, but now that my uncle and aunt are gone and I've learned a little bit more about who my father was, I'm going to go by that name.
Yeah.
You might have that a little bit more if you learned, like, if Obi-Wan, was that the first time that he ever heard his dad's, like, last name there?
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
I know they talk about, like, apparently he knew my father.
I mean, I read so much into that scene anyway. I can read one more.
Sure, yeah. But yeah, I don't know. It was just one of those things where, like, as talking about it, we kind of started just crafting and theorizing and stuff too. And it's like, I don't know how names are done in Star Wars or anything. Like, Han Solo's last name is clearly not originally Solo, but he doesn't know who he is or where it came from, and they just made it up. You know,
so many characters have just one name; they don't have a surname in Star Wars. And I don't know why the Empire is conforming. No, everybody's got to have two. We'll make them up. You know, but I suppose that's kind of similar to like. People that would come into America and in the New World, they would like Englishify their names or give them like, what, you don't have a last name? Okay, you're Smithson because you're the son of a Smith, or something like that.
Yeah, a lot of names came from like jobs and stuff, right?
From vocations.
Yeah, so like that is a common thing that happened
in
history.
That Skywalker, Anakin, Luke, Rey, they do that name proud.
Yeah,
they are all three incredible pilots.
Yeah,
you know?
And Shmi being like a slave, I don't know her slave history.
No.
You know, we talked about like if Tales of the Skywalker, do we get to see Shmi before Watto or what happened there? But like, who was her parents or what's her lineage from? You know?
Go with me here because I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But we know the name Skywalker separately is from the Chiss.
Sure.
We know. I don't know if we know this. The Chiss appear in the Old Republic, meaning that they're not just in the Chaos and the Unknown regions. They've spread out.
Sure, and it's referenced in one of the books at some point, too, of like having some kind of like...
Okay, I'm making this up on the spot. What if the Grisk want the Skywalker so they can use them, right?
Yeah,
what
they're trying to figure out how they
What
navigate.
If they can't get Chiss, but they get another Force-sensitive young one, and it's Shmi Skywalker, and she's an amazing pilot and all this stuff, you know? Then they erase her mind. And I don't know. I was just coming up with something. And that's how she's called Skywalker.
The Chiss getter or the Grisk getter?
I was saying, because I don't imagine the Chiss would bring a human to do that. That would be probably against what they're saying. But the Grisk, maybe in trying to like crack the code of what the Chiss do, might be like Force sensitive. Oh, this lady seems like she's Force sensitive. Look at this midichlorian thing. It's weird, you know? And then that's just me playing around and trying to come up with a reason. Because that's the only other thing is that the Skywalker name appears here and it appears here, and we know nothing else about it.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, and it seems to be separate.
Yeah.
And isn't it officially like the Chiss language closest to Galactic Basic is Skywalker? It's not that they use the word Skywalker, right? Because they're speaking a different language.
I mean, yeah, they must be speaking their language.
Their mouth sound isn't Skywalker. That's just what it translates to. Am I right about that? Skywalker is like the translation. Yeah. Okay. We also got a sub.
Thank you, Megamind.
Megamind, thank you.
Sup, Blind Waves.
Sup, Megamind 754. Another thing I was thinking of while you were mentioning like the Rey taking the Skywalker name. You remember? This would be a weird connection, but remember like a couple badonkagonks ago we were talking about Lucas's original ending when like Obi-Wan dies and Qui-Gon takes his name at the end of that movie?
Yeah.
Like we talked about how that was the original ending and it changed. If that were to happen, that would be kind of like an interesting bookend of like, well, Rey takes Skywalker's name, like her master's name.
Yeah.
Like, oh, shit, that kind of would have worked.
Yeah.
A little bit there. But
would have had some connections.
It would have had a little bit of connection. I mean, I know that Rey taking Skywalker name is kind of this, like, flag for people that don't like those movies to be like, no, she stole it and all this stuff. But I'm like, Luke and Leia are right there. They're like, yes, be part of the family. The name Skywalker shouldn't die with us. It should live on. People should continue to look to the sky and hope the Skywalkers will help us.
Sure. The name Skywalker with those kids was hope. Right, that was a hope thing. People were hopeful. Luke Skywalker, he's a hero, right? Like it was something they looked at and inspired them, and you want to keep that inspiration going. So, no, I get that, and I never had issues with it. I just thought, like, in the idea of having a name that, like, in Game of Thrones, you don't want to be a Snow. You want to have, like, a real last name. You know what I mean? I thought it'd be interesting. It's like, well, what if Snow became something that meant something? Yeah. And people were like, no, I'm going to take it.
Really turn that name around.
Yeah, it changes it. And now Snow isn't as big of an insult as people would think it would be or something,
It's like Deku.
Yeah, exactly.
From My Hero Academia.
He takes that name and turns it into his hero name. Yeah. And he makes it his own then, So, I don't know. Interesting little thought experiment I had with that. But
definitely.
But yeah, I don't know what chat thinks of that. I did see, while you were talking about it, Nexus said something about in the Queen's, which one was it? Queen's Hope story. Shmi helped to develop a device to help free the slaves. Yeah. So like she's done some other things.
Well, I mean, Anakin. We can't just say that everything special about Anakin is from the Force. I think that diminishes him. I think that his natural abilities as a pilot is also talent. Mm-hmm. But I think that his ability to fix things could very well come from Shmi.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, being compassionate and curious comes from Shmi.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Shmi taught him about mechanics. Yeah.
Good.
Yep. But anyway, that was my Skywalker conversation that I kind of wanted to bring up a little bit here.